High-resolution security cameras at the Grand Metropolitan Gala never captured the truth of what happened near the marble staircase. That evening, Victor Hahn, a man whose influence could silence an entire city block with one phone call, moved through the tuxedo-clad crowd completely unnoticed. He expected the usual: artificial laughter, expensive perfume, and businessmen trading secrets. Instead, he noticed a 19-year-old woman, Elena Park, walking beside a man who kept a suffocatingly firm grip on her arm. Her movements were liquid and mechanical, the posture of someone who had learned that sudden gestures brought swift consequences. A high-collared silk dress hid the marks, but a faint, poorly concealed bruise marred the porcelain line of her jaw, an injury born of impact, not accident. As she drifted past him, she didn't speak or slow her pace. She only lifted her hand for half a second, her thumb tucked and fingers pressed flat. No one else in the room saw the signal, but Victor did. Victor Hahn didn't believe in coincidences. He believed in the weight of a glance and the terror that lived in the space between words. At that moment, he knew the polished gala was merely a stage for a much darker reality. The Grand Metropolitan Gala was a masterclass in choreographed deception. Beneath the weight of crystal chandeliers and the melodic hum of a string quartet, the city's elite performed a dance of curated smiles and calculated handshakes. Victor Hahn stood near a fluted marble column, a glass of untouched vintage scotch in his hand, his presence as unremarkable as a shadow in a room full of blinding light. He wore a charcoal suit tailored with surgical precision, devoid of the ostentatious cufflinks or gold timepieces that usually signaled a man of his standing. In this room, power was often measured by how much noise one made. Victor's power, however, lay in his ability to remain a silent observer, a predator watching the herd from the tall grass of anonymity. He wasn't here for the art or the charity. He was here because the movements of the wealthy often predated the movements of the markets, and Victor made it his business to know which way the wind was blowing before the first leaf fell. But as he surveyed the room, his internal compass, honed by a decade of navigating the lethal currents of the underworld, snagged on a jagged edge in the scenery. It was Elena Park. She was 19, perhaps 20, and she wore a high-collared dress of midnight blue silk that shimmered like deep water. To the casual observer, she was a stunning accessory to the man beside her, Julian Vane, a venture capitalist whose public reputation was as polished as his silver hair. But Victor didn't look at the dress or the jewelry that clung to her throat like a gilded leash. He looked at her eyes. They were wide, fixed on a point somewhere in the middle distance, reflecting the light of the chandeliers without truly seeing it. Victor watched them navigate the crowd. Vane's hand was clamped firmly above Elena's elbow, his thumb exerting a steady, rhythmic pressure that looked like an affectionate squeeze to the uninitiated. To Victor, it was a tactical restraint. Every time a passerby stopped to exchange pleasantries, Elena's smile appeared, a perfect practiced mask, but it never reached the muscles around her eyes. Her breathing was shallow, controlled, as if she were trying to occupy as little space as possible. "A lovely couple, aren't they?" A voice murmured beside Victor. It was Marcus, one of Victor's associates, leaning in with a look of feigned interest. "They are a performance," Victor replied, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that barely carried over the music. "Look at her feet, Marcus." Marcus glanced down. Elena was wearing delicate heels, but her weight was shifted back, her ankles locked. She wasn't walking with Vane, she was being steered. Every step she took was a reaction to the invisible lead Vane held over her. "She looks nervous. It's a big room," Marcus shrugged. "Nervous is a tremor in the hands," Victor countered, his gaze never leaving the girl. "That isn't nervousness. That is the stillness of a creature that has realized the exit is locked. She is cataloguing the room, looking for a way out, and finding nothing but people who are paid to look the other way." As the pair moved closer to the staircase, the light shifted, catching the side of Elena's face. For a fleeting second, the heavy foundation she wore failed her. A slight swelling, a shadow of yellow and deep purple, peeked out from beneath her jawline. It was a mark of violence hidden behind the veneer of luxury. Victor felt a cold, familiar weight settle in his chest, the ghost of Isabella. 7 years ago, he had seen similar shadows on a young woman in his employ. He had told himself it wasn't his business, that his world was built on profit, not empathy. Isabella had ended up in a cold canal because Victor had chosen the safety of silence over the messiness of intervention. He had spent the years since building an empire of shadows, but the rot of that one decision remained in his bones. He told himself he was a businessman, a man of cold logic, but as he watched Vane lean in to whisper something into Alina's ear, causing her to flinch almost imperceptibly, the logic began to fracture. The gala continued its frantic, expensive pace. Trays of champagne circulated, laughter echoed off the vaulted ceilings, and the benefactor continued to parade his prize. Vane was expansive, his gestures wide and inviting, playing the role of the generous mentor to a young college student. He spoke of her potential and her bright future, while his fingers never once left the skin of her arm. Victor moved then, not toward them, but on a parallel track, weaving through the clusters of socialites with the fluid grace of a man who knew exactly how to move through a crowd without touching a single soul. He positioned himself near the edge of the champagne fountain, a vantage point that put him directly in Alina's line of sight as they made their turn toward the balcony. He waited, he didn't stare, but he made his presence felt, a steady, unblinking anchor in a sea of shifting faces. He wanted her to see him, not the businessman, not the donor, but the man who knew what a bruise looked like under a layer of Chanel powder. When their eyes finally met, the air seemed to thin between them. For Alina, the world of the gala, the noise, the heat, the crushing weight of Vane's hand seemed to fall away. She saw a man who wasn't smiling. She saw a man whose eyes held the cold, hard clarity of a winter dawn. In that look, Victor didn't offer pity, he offered recognition. He was a predator, yes, but he was a predator who recognized a cage when he saw one. Vane turned to greet a city councilman, his grip loosening by a fraction of an inch as he gestured with his free hand. It was the only opening she would get. Alina didn't look away from Victor. Her hand, hanging at her side, moved with a subtle, desperate flick, her thumb tucked into her palm, her fingers folding over it in a silent, universal plea for rescue. It was a half-second of truth in a night built on lies. The signal vanished as quickly as it appeared. Alina's face returned to its porcelain mask as Vane's hand snapped back onto her arm, pulling her closer. They moved on, disappearing into the throng of guests near the terrace. Victor stayed where he was, his hand tightening around the base of his glass until the knuckles turned white. The scotch rippled, reflecting the fractured light of the chandeliers. The gala was no longer a place of business. Gate 47, the Chicago terminal, the canal in New York, all the places where he had watched and waited merged into this single room. He put the glass down on a passing waiter's tray. The ice hadn't even begun to melt. "Marcus," Victor said, not turning his head. "Sir." "Find out where Vane is staying. I want the floor plans, the security detail, and the girl's history. Everything from her birth certificate to her last bank statement." "Sir, Vane is a major donor. He has ties to the DA's office. Moving on him would be loud." Victor turned then, his eyes dark and bottomless, the refined businessman replaced by the man who made city blocks go quiet. "I didn't say I was going to move on him," Victor whispered, the threat hanging in the air like a sharpened blade. "I'm going to dismantle him. And Marcus, do it quickly. I've spent enough of my life being a man who pays attention too late." Victor walked toward the exit, his shadow lengthening across the polished floor. The gala continued behind him, a symphony of lies that had finally met a truth it couldn't drown out. The game had changed, and for the first time in 7 years, Victor Hahn was no longer just watching. The black town car moved through the rain-slicked streets of the city like a predatory shark cutting through dark water. Inside, the cabin was a sanctuary of leather and silence, but for Victor Hahn, the quiet was heavy. He leaned his head back against the headrest, closing his eyes, yet the image of Alina Park, the midnight blue silk, the tucked thumb, the haunted vacancy in her gaze, remained burned into his retinas. It was a specific kind of silence. To most, silence was merely the absence of sound, but in Victor's world, silence was a language. It was the frantic stillness of a soldier before an ambush. It was the hollow hush of a room after a life had been taken. And now, it was the crushing weight of a memory he had spent 7 years trying to bury. Isabella had been 24. She was a bookkeeper for one of his legitimate shipping fronts, a woman with a quick wit and a penchant for bright yellow scarves that defied the grey monotony of the docks. Victor remembered the day he had seen her in the warehouse office. She had been wearing a thick scarf, even though the heaters were humming at full blast. When she reached for a file, the silk slipped, revealing the jagged, angry blossoming of a handprint on her neck. He had seen it. He had catalogued the way she flinched when her husband, a charming foreman named Elias, entered the room. He had recognized the mechanical precision of her work, the way she threw herself into the numbers to avoid the reality of her own skin. At the time, Victor's mentor had told him that a king does not concern himself with the domestic squabbles of his subjects. "It is messy, Victor," the old man had said, "and mess is expensive. Keep your eyes on the ledger." Victor had kept his eyes on the ledger. 2 weeks later, the police pulled Isabella's body from the Hudson. The bright yellow scarf had been used to ensure she stayed under. The town car hit a pothole, the slight jolt bringing Victor back to the present. He opened his eyes and looked out the tinted window. The neon lights of the city blurred into long, bleeding streaks of red and blue. "Patterns," he whispered to the empty car. His life was built on them. The pattern of a rival's spending that signaled a coup. The pattern of a politician's speech that hinted at a betrayal. But the pattern he saw in Julian Vane was the most dangerous kind because it was draped in the cloth of respectability. Vane wasn't a street thug with a cheap pistol. He was a man who used contracts, NDAs, and opportunities to build a cage. Victor pulled a thin, encrypted tablet from the seat pocket. His team had already begun the harvest. Files began to populate the screen. Alina's scholarship applications, her father's medical bills, the predatory loan that Julian Vane's holding company had quietly purchased 3 months before she started appearing at his side. It was the same architecture of entrapment. Vane didn't just want a companion, he wanted a possession that owed him its very breath. Victor scrolled through the data, his jaw tightening. Alina was a Dean's List student, a girl who had worked 3 jobs to keep her family afloat until the debt became a mountain she couldn't climb. Then came Vane, the benefactor, offering a ladder that turned out to be a noose. The car slowed as it approached Victor's private residence, a fortress of glass and steel perched above the city. He didn't move to get out. He stared at the screen, seeing the girl's face in her student ID photo, smiling, eyes bright, before the shadow had dimmed them. He recognized the too careful walk now. It wasn't just physical pain, it was the constant, exhausting vigilance of living with a human landmine. You learn to walk on eggshells until your feet bleed, and then you learn to walk on the blood so you don't leave a trail. Vane's grip on her arm at the gala hadn't just been about control, it had been a reminder. I own the debt, I own the medicine, I own the floor beneath your feet. Victor felt a cold, familiar rage beginning to simmer beneath his ribs. It wasn't the hot, impulsive anger of a young man. It was the tectonic shift of a man who had decided that a certain part of the world was about to end. For 7 years, he had told himself that he was a businessman of the shadows, that he dealt in the macro-logistics of power and let the micro-tragedies resolve themselves. But as he looked at the signal Alina had made, the universal plea for a stranger to stop being a stranger, he realized that his smart choices had cost him his soul. He had traded Isabella's life for a clean ledger, and the interest on that debt had been rotting him from the inside out ever since. He thought of the way the other guests at the gala had looked at the couple. They saw a success story. They saw a mentor and a muse. They saw what they were supposed to see because the truth was inconvenient. It would require them to put down their champagne and risk their social standing to ask a difficult question. Victor, however, was a man who had already lost his standing in the light. He had no reputation to protect among the virtuous. He was the monster in the closet, and for the first time, he found a profound, lethal utility in that fact. If the law couldn't touch a man like Vane because of his donations and his dinners with the district attorney, then the law was a blunt instrument. Victor was a scalpel. He tapped a button on the intercom to the driver's compartment. "Marcus." "Yes, sir." "Contact Wyatt. Tell him we aren't waiting for the morning. I want Vane's personal security scheduled by midnight. Every guard, every camera, every biometric lock in that penthouse." "Sir, we still haven't confirmed the location of the girl's original documents. If we move too fast, Vane might destroy them. He's known for a scorched earth policy when he loses his leverage." Victor looked at his own reflection in the window, a man of shadows, old enough to know better, but finally willing to feel. "He won't have time to burn anything," Victor said, his voice as sharp as a winter frost. "We aren't going there to negotiate. We're going there to show him that some shadows are darker than his." He thought of Alina in that midnight blue dress, a prisoner in a room full of people. The weight of the silence she carried was the same weight he had carried since Isabella's funeral. Every second he waited was another second she had to hold her breath. "The pattern ends tonight, Marcus. Drive." As the car accelerated, Victor felt the last of his detachment crumble. He wasn't Grayson Wolfe at an airport, and he wasn't a businessman at a gala. He was a man with a debt to a ghost, and he was finally going to pay it. The silence of the city outside seemed to deepen, waiting for the storm that was coming. Victor Han had spent his life noticing what others ignored. Tonight, he would make sure Julian Vane noticed exactly what happens when the shadows decide to fight back. The string quartet had shifted to a minor key, the mournful pull of the cellos weaving through the clinking of crystal like a warning. Victor Han did not move from his position by the champagne fountain, yet his entire being was now a finely tuned instrument of interception. He watched the crowd part for Julian Vane and Alina Park as they began their slow, forced march toward the grand staircase. To the hundreds of guests, they were a vision of prestige, the benefactor and his protégé, but to Victor, they were a hunter and a wounded creature, the former's fingers digging into the latter's arm with a possessive ferocity that left white marks on her pale skin. Victor adjusted his stance, his eyes narrowing as he calculated the distance. He needed her to look at him one more time. In the world of the syndicate, eyes were the only things that couldn't be bribed into lying. They were the windows through which a soul screamed when the mouth was sewn shut by fear. As they reached the base of the stairs, a boisterous group of young heirs intercepted Vane, seeking his blessing on a new venture. Vane's face transformed instantly into that of the genial mentor, his booming laugh echoing off the marble. It was a practiced, hollow sound. In that moment of social distraction, his grip loosened, just by a fraction, as he reached out to clap a young man on the shoulder. Alina didn't run. She knew better. Instead, her head turned with a slow, agonizing caution, her gaze sweeping the room like a lighthouse searching for a shore that hadn't already been claimed by the storm. When her eyes hit the fluted column where Victor stood, they stopped. The air between them seemed to vibrate with the frequency of a silent scream. Alina saw him, the man in the charcoal suit who wasn't drinking, wasn't laughing, and wasn't looking away. She saw the lethal stillness in his frame and realized that he wasn't part of the play. He was the only one in the room who saw the bruises beneath the silk and the shackles made of debt. Her right hand, partially shielded by the folds of her midnight blue dress, rose just high enough for him to see. It was the signal, the thumb tucked into the center of the palm, the four fingers slowly closing over it like a cage door shutting. 1, 2, 3. It was a 5-finger countdown to a total collapse of hope. It was the signal for help. A silent code designed for the moments when words are the most dangerous things a woman can possess. Victor didn't blink, he didn't nod, he didn't reach for his phone or signal his men. To do so would have been a death sentence for her in the car ride home. Instead, he did something far more profound. He locked his gaze onto hers and allowed the mask of the businessman to drop entirely. For 3 seconds, Victor Han let her see the monster he truly was, the man who had ordered the dismantling of empires and the silencing of cities. He let her see the cold, unyielding darkness that lived in his chest, and he directed it entirely at the man standing beside her. It was a promise. He didn't offer a comforting smile. He offered the terrifying assurance of a man who was about to go to war for her. The acknowledgement was a single, microscopic tilt of his chin, a silent "I see you." Alina's chest rose in a jagged, shaky breath. The vacancy in her eyes flickered, replaced by a spark of raw, terrifying clarity. She had been heard. The signal had been received by the one man in the city who didn't care about Vane's donations or his pedigree. Vane's hand snapped back onto her arm, his fingers finding the exact same pressure points as before. He leaned in, his silver hair brushing her ear as he whispered something that made her entire body go rigid. He began to lead her up the stairs, his pace increasing, sensed perhaps by some primal instinct that the atmosphere in the room had shifted. Victor watched them ascend. He watched the way Alina's hand dropped back to her side, her fingers now curled into a tight, trembling fist. She didn't look back, she didn't need to. The pact had been made in the space between heartbeats. As they disappeared onto the second floor, landing toward the private exits, Victor turned away from the fountain. He didn't look at the gala anymore. The lights, the music, and the finery were now just obstacles in a tactical environment. He felt the old, familiar coldness spreading through his limbs, the same coldness that had guided him through the docks and the backrooms of his youth. But this time, it was fueled by a redemptive heat. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over a single contact labeled Wyatt. The signal was confirmed, Victor said, his voice a low, lethal hum. "She's in the car. Vane is taking her to the penthouse. Block the exits, cut the feed to the building's external security, and have the cleaners on standby. We aren't doing this the quiet way. Sir, Wyatt's voice came through the encrypted line. Moving on the penthouse directly is a high-profile breach. The police response time for that district is less than 4 minutes. Then we make sure the police are busy elsewhere, Victor replied, his eyes fixed on the empty space on the stairs where Alina had stood. Call the unions. Tell them to start the protest on 5th Avenue now. I want a gridlock that God himself couldn't drive through. And Wyatt. Yes, sir. When we get inside, Julian Vane belongs to me. No one touches him until I've had the chance to look him in the eye and show him exactly what it looks like when the silence finally breaks. Victor walked toward the heavy oak doors of the gala hall. As he stepped out into the cool night air, the rain began to fall in earnest, washing the smell of expensive perfume from his senses. He looked up at the towering glass monolith of Vane's penthouse in the distance, a gleaming jewel of stolen lives and leveraged dreams. For 7 years, Victor had been haunted by the woman he didn't see. Tonight, he would be the nightmare for the man who thought he could hide his sins in plain sight. He stepped into the waiting town car, the door closing with a heavy, final thud. The time for observation was over. The 5-finger signal had been a countdown, and at 0, the world of Julian Vane was going to burn. The transition from the warmth of the gala to the interior of the moving vehicle was like stepping from a stage play into a war room. As the city lights blurred into streaks of neon across the rain-drenched windows, Victor Hahn sat enveloped in a cold, blue-tinged darkness. He didn't look like a businessman anymore. The mask of civility had been discarded at the curb, leaving only the sharp, geometric lines of a man who dealt in the architecture of ruin. Ghost protocol, Victor said, the words barely more than a breath, yet they carried the weight of a death warrant. Beside him, Marcus opened a secure laptop, its screen casting an ethereal glow over their faces. In the world of high-level organized crime, Ghost protocol was not a physical assault. It was the systematic erasure of a man's identity, assets, and reputation before the first blow was ever landed. It was the art of making a giant realize he was standing on a floor of glass just as the first hammer strike fell. Vane thinks he is protected by his digital footprint, Victor murmured, his eyes fixed on the cascading lines of data. He thinks his charities and his board memberships are a shield. I want him to realize they are targets. Marcus's fingers flew across the keys, initiating the sweep. We're bypassing the surface-level encryption of Vane Holdings. Wyatt is already tapping the internal server at the penthouse. We're not just looking for evidence of what he's doing to Alina, we're looking for the foundation of his entire life. To the world, Julian Vane was a titan of venture capital, a man who invested in people. But as Ghost Protocol peeled back the layers of his offshore accounts and private correspondence, a different creature emerged. The trustworthy mask didn't just slip, it was flayed away. They found the shell companies used to buy the debt of struggling families with daughters in prestigious universities. They found the NDAs signed under duress, the scholarship funds that were nothing more than payroll for a rotating door of victims who had disappeared into the silence of settlements and fear. Victor watched the screen with a detachment that was more terrifying than anger. He was looking for the leverage points, the structural weaknesses in Vane's soul. He saw the way Vane used his influence with the district attorney to bury a misunderstanding at a hotel 3 years ago. He saw the digital trail of a man who believed he was untouchable because he had bought everyone who was supposed to be watching. He uses a proprietary encryption for his private archives, Marcus noted, his brow furrowed. It's military grade. It will take the mainframe at the warehouse 20 minutes to crack it. He's a man who values his secrets, Victor said, leaning forward. But every secret has a cost. Look at the financial flows around the medical facility in Queens, the one where Alina's father is being treated. Marcus navigated to the medical records. Vane isn't just paying the bills, sir. He's the majority shareholder of the clinic. He's been adjusting the father's treatment plan based on Alina's cooperation. If she stays in line, the father gets the best care. If she doesn't, he's holding a dying man's life as a bargaining chip. Victor's voice was a low, dangerous rumble. This was the pattern. This was the same mechanism of control that had kept Isabella trapped, the belief that the predator held the keys to everything the victim loved. Victor felt the ghost of Isabella standing in the corner of the car, her yellow scarf a splash of color in the gloom. He had ignored the pattern once because it was messy. Now he realized that the mess was the only thing worth cleaning. Vane wasn't a genius. He was a coward who used spreadsheets as a whip. "Wyatt is in position," Marcus announced. "He's looped the penthouse security cameras. Vane and the girl just stepped off the private elevator. Vane has disabled the internal sensors for the next hour. He wants privacy." "A mistake," Victor said. "He thinks privacy protects him. He doesn't realize it also protects us. Start the liquidation. I want his bank accounts frozen for suspicious activity by the time we reach the lobby. I want his board of directors to receive the initial leak regarding his offshore tax havens. Give him 10 minutes to feel the world getting smaller. I want him to hear the walls closing in before he hears my footsteps." The car turned onto the private drive of the glass monolith. The building was a testament to Vane's vanity, a spire of steel that looked down on the rest of the city. Victor checked the time on his simple, black watch. In the digital world, Julian Vane was already a ghost. His credit cards were useless. His reputation was hemorrhaging in the dark web's forums of the elite. And his legal protections were being systematically dismantled by Victor's team of legal architects. Victor stepped out of the car, the rain drumming against his shoulders. He didn't carry a weapon. He didn't need one. He carried the weight of every truth Vane had tried to bury. "Tell Wyatt to kill the elevators once I'm on the top floor," Victor instructed Marcus. "No one gets in, and Julian Vane absolutely does not get out. He wanted a night of silence. I'm going to give him exactly that." As he entered the lobby, the security guards stood up, sensing the shift in the air. They were trained to spot trouble, but they weren't trained for Victor Hahn. He walked past them with the confidence of the building's true owner, his eyes focused on the elevator bank. Before a guard could even reach for a radio, the lobby's computer systems flickered and died, replaced by a single, static-filled image of the Hahn Syndicate's crest. Victor stepped into the elevator. As the doors slid shut, he saw his reflection in the polished chrome. A man who had spent 7 years running from a shadow, finally realizing that the only way to kill a shadow was to step into it. The elevator began its silent, rapid ascent toward the penthouse. The ghost protocol was complete. Julian Vane was now a man with no name, no money, and no friends. All he had left was a girl in a midnight blue dress and the man who was coming to take her back. The bell chimed as the elevator reached the top floor. Victor smoothed the front of his charcoal jacket, took a breath of the cold, filtered air, and stepped out into the hallway. The predator's mask was gone. Now it was time to meet the man behind it. The penthouse was a cathedral of glass and cold, white light, but the air inside felt thick with the static of a collapsing empire. As Victor stepped deeper into the foyer, his footsteps muffled by a silk Persian rug, his tablet vibrated with a relentless stream of incoming data. Marcus and the technical team were no longer just skimming the surface. They had breached the core of Julian Vane's private vault. What they found was not just a collection of secrets, but a digital architecture designed to paralyze the human soul. Victor stopped in the shadows of the hallway, his eyes scanning the data scrolling across his screen. It was a ledger of human misery, meticulously organized. He leaned against a cold marble wall, the blue light of the tablet reflecting in his dark eyes as he began to understand the true nature of Alina's cage. It wasn't built of iron bars, but of digital shackles. A complex web of financial and legal leverage that ensured her compliance more effectively than any physical lock could. The first shackle was financial. The team had uncovered a series of high-interest predatory loans that had been funneled through 3 different shell companies, all leading back to a single offshore account owned by Vane. These weren't loans given to Alina, they were loans given to her father for his life-saving experimental treatments. Vane had quietly bought the debt from the original lenders, then restructured it with clauses that made it impossible to pay back. Every month Alina remained loyal, the interest was deferred. Every time she showed a hint of resistance, the collection agencies, also owned by Vane, threatened to seize her family's home and terminate the father's medical care. Victor's jaw tightened as he swiped to the next file. The second shackle was legal. Vane had used his influence to craft a series of ironclad non-disclosure agreements and personal services contracts that were masquerading as scholarship papers. Alina had signed them when she was barely 18, likely believing she was securing her future. In reality, she had signed away her right to speak, her right to travel, and her right to her own identity. Vane had even gone so far as to store her original birth certificate, passport, and social security card in a high-security digital safe, replacing her physical world with a digital existence that he controlled. "So we've found the enforcement folder," Marcus's voice crackled through the earpiece. "It's worse than we thought. He isn't just tracking her movements through her phone. He's using a proprietary app disguised as a health monitor. It records her heart rate, her location, and even the ambient noise around her. He's been listening to her every breath for 6 months." Victor looked toward the heavy oak doors at the end of the hall. He could hear the faint, muffled sound of Vane's voice, arrogant, smooth, and entirely unaware that his world had been hollowed out. The Ghost Protocol had already severed Vane's access to these accounts. To Vane, the digital safe would now appear empty. The loans would show as settled. The contracts would appear as corrupted, unreadable files. Victor had effectively erased the shackles before he had even reached the prisoner. But the psychological damage was another matter. Victor saw the progress reports Vane kept on Alina. They read like a trainer's log for a show animal. Subject showed 14% increase in heart rate during gala rehearsal. Intervention required. Reminder sent regarding father's medication schedule. It was a clinical, soulless documentation of a young woman's spirit being systematically broken. Victor closed the tablet and felt the ghost of Isabella stir again. This was the modern version of the yellow scarf. Back then it was physical intimidation and the threat of the docks. Now it was data points and debt ratios. The predator had evolved, but the underlying rot was the same. Vane believed that because he owned the paperwork, he owned the person. He believed that power was something you could quantify in a spreadsheet. "Marcus," Victor whispered into his collar, "ensure that the settlement notifications are sent to Alina's father's hospital immediately. I want his debt cleared in the system before I open that door. And the digital vault, wipe everything. Leave nothing for Vane to hold over her. Not a single bite." "Already done, sir. The hospital has confirmed receipt. The father is legally debt-free. As far as the government is concerned, Alina Park has never signed a single contract with Julian Vane." Victor took a deep breath, the cold air filling his lungs. He could feel the weight of the digital shackles falling away in the ether, a silent liberation occurring across servers halfway around the world. But the most dangerous part remained, the physical presence of the man who still thought he was the master. He thought of the 5-finger signal Alina had made at the gala. She had reached out across the abyss, hoping that someone, anyone, would understand that her silence was a scream. She hadn't known about the servers, the shell companies, or the Ghost Protocol. She only knew that she was drowning. Victor straightened his jacket. He was no longer just a man who noticed what others ignored. He was the force of nature that had come to balance the ledger. He reached for the handle of the double doors, his movements slow and deliberate. Beyond this door, Julian Vane was about to find out that when you take everything from someone, you leave them with nothing to lose. And when you take everything from a man like Victor Hahn, you leave him with nothing but a purpose. The latch clicked, the digital world was dark, the shackles were broken, and the only thing left was the confrontation. Victor pushed the door open, stepping into the room where the predator was waiting, still believing he held the leash. The doors to the primary living suite swung open with a heavy, rhythmic thud that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. Inside, the room was a sprawling expanse of glass and minimalist ego, looking out over the flickering grid of a city that Julian Vane believed he owned. At the sound of the intrusion, Vane spun around, his face flushing with the indignant rage of a man who had never been told no within his own walls. Alina sat on the edge of a white leather sofa, her body coiled tight, her hands clasped so hard in her lap that her knuckles were the color of bone. "Who the hell are you?" Vane demanded, his voice sharp and serrated. He hadn't recognized Victor from the gala. To Vane, people like Victor were just background noise to his own greatness. "Security, get in here." Victor didn't stop walking. He moved with a slow, predatory deliberateness, his hands loosely at his sides. He didn't look like a man about to commit a crime. He looked like a man who had already arrived at the verdict. "The security is busy, Julian," Victor said, his voice a low, gravelly hum that seemed to suck the air out of the room. "They're currently occupied with a sudden and total failure of their employment contracts. And as for who I am, I'm the man who's been reading your mail." Victor stopped 10 feet away, his presence commanding the center of the room. He briefly cut his eyes to Alina. She was staring at him, her breath coming in short, jagged hitches. The terror was still there, but beneath it, a flicker of recognition was beginning to take root. He saw her chest rise and fall, 1, 2, 3, mirroring the signal she had given him. Johann, Vane said, the color draining from his face as the name finally connected with the face. He tried to reclaim his posture, straightening his silk tie. I don't know what you think you're doing here, but I have friends in places you can't even imagine. I can have you buried in litigation before you leave this building. Litigation, Victor repeated, the word sounding like a joke in his mouth. You think you're in a boardroom, Julian. You think there's a process. But I've spent the last 20 minutes dismantling the world you live in. Your bank accounts are frozen. Your private vault is empty. And the debt you've been using as a leash for Alina's father, it doesn't exist anymore. Vane scoffed, a desperate, high-pitched sound. He reached for his phone on the mahogany side table, but before his fingers could touch the glass, the screen flickered to life with a red "System terminated" warning. The power dynamic has shifted, Victor said, stepping closer. Vane instinctively took a step back, stumbling slightly against the edge of his desk. You've spent years making people feel small. You've hidden behind NDAs and digital shadows. You thought you were the one holding the leash because you had the paperwork. But in my world, Julian, paperwork is just fuel for the fire. The only thing that matters is what's standing in front of you. Victor turned his full attention back to Alina. Alina, stand up. She hesitated, her eyes darting to Vane out of a year of conditioned fear. Vane sensed his grip slipping and tried to bark an order. Alina, stay where you are. He's a criminal, he. I said stand up, Victor interrupted, his voice not loud, but possessing the finality of a falling axe. Alina rose. She was trembling, her legs unsteady, but she stood. For the first time in months, she wasn't looking at the floor. She was looking at the man who had answered her signal. Walk to the door, Victor instructed. Wyatt is waiting in the hall. He has a car and a secured perimeter. You are leaving this room and you are never coming back. She isn't going anywhere, Vane shouted, his voice cracking. She signed a contract. I own the... In a movement so fast it was almost a blur, Victor closed the distance. He didn't strike Vane. Instead, he grabbed the front of Vane's expensive dress shirt and slammed him back against the floor-to-ceiling window. The glass groaned under the impact, a terrifying sound 60 stories above the pavement. Vane let out a strangled yelp, his hands clawing at Victor's forearms. Victor leaned in close, his face inches from Vane's. You don't own a soul in this room. You don't even own the air you're breathing right now. I've seen the progress reports, Julian. I've seen the way you tracked her heart rate. I've seen the way you used a dying man to satisfy your pathetic need for control. Victor's voice dropped to a whisper, cold enough to frost the glass behind them. 7 years ago, I watched a woman die because I thought men like you were too messy to deal with. I told myself it was smart to look away. I've spent every night since then tasting the salt of that canal. But tonight I'm not being smart. I'm being the man the world thinks I am. He increased the pressure, Vane's heels leaving the floor. The ghost protocol is done. Your reputation is currently being fed to the sharks on the dark web. By morning, your board of directors will be issuing a statement of total disassociation. You aren't a titan anymore, Julian. You're a footnote. And if you so much as think her name again, I won't use a computer to erase you. I'll do it with my own hands. He released Vane, who slumped to the floor in a heap of rumpled silk and shattered pride. He looked small, pathetic, and hollowed out, stripped of the digital armor that had made him feel like a god. Victor turned back to Alina. She was standing by the door, her hand on the frame. The midnight blue dress was crumpled, but her posture had changed. The mechanical rigidity was gone, replaced by a raw, fragile humanity. Go, Victor said, his tone softening just enough for her to hear the sincerity beneath the iron. Your father is being moved to a private facility in the morning. He's safe. You're safe. Alina looked at him, her lips trembling. She didn't say thank you, the word was too small for what had just happened. She simply touched her throat, where the bruises were hidden, and nodded once. Then she turned and disappeared into the hallway, where the shadows of Victor's men were waiting to lead her into the light. Victor stood alone in the center of the penthouse for a moment. He looked at the city below, the same city that had once felt like a ledger of targets and assets. For the first time, it looked like a place where people lived. He could hear Vane sobbing on the floor behind him, the sound of a man realizing that his money couldn't buy him out of the darkness he had created. Victor didn't look back. He adjusted his jacket, feeling the weight of the silence lift from his own shoulders. The penthouse was broken, the predator was ruined, and the girl was gone. He walked toward the elevator, his reflection in the glass showing a man who was no longer just a boss of the underworld. He was a man who had finally paid his debt to a ghost. As the elevator doors slid shut, the only sound left in the room was the wind howling against the glass, a hollow echo of a power that had vanished in a single, silent gesture. The penthouse felt different now, the air thinner, stripped of the artificial grandeur that Julian Vane had used to suffocate his victims. Vane remained on the floor, a heap of expensive wool and broken nerves, his eyes darting between Victor's polished shoes and the darkened screens of his high-tech fortress. Victor did not loom over him. He simply stood in the center of the room, a pillar of immovable shadow, waiting for the silence to do its work. "The digital world has a memory, Julian," Victor said, his voice cutting through the quiet like a razor. "But memories can be corrupted. They can be overwritten until the original truth is nothing but static. That is what we are going to do tonight." Victor pulled a sleek, silver drive from his pocket and tossed it onto the mahogany desk. It landed with a dull thud that sounded like a gavel. "Get up." Vane scrambled to his feet, his movements clumsy and devoid of the grace he had displayed at the gala. He sat in his ergonomic chair, his hands trembling so violently he had to grip the edge of the desk to steady them. Victor stood behind him, a presence so heavy it seemed to press the very breath from Vane's lungs. "Log in," Victor commanded, "not to the company servers, to the private drive, the one you think nobody knows about, the archive." Vane hesitated, his fingers hovering over the biometric scanner. "If I give you that, I have nothing left. That's my insurance." "You have no insurance, Julian. You have a choice." Victor leaned down, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper near Vane's ear. "You can delete every trace of Alina Park, every photo, every contract, every recording of her voice, and sign the release forms my team has prepared. Or I can leave you here for the people I've just leaked your offshore tax data to. They aren't as patient as I am, and they don't care about justice. They care about the $40 million you've hidden from them." The blood drained from Vane's face. He pressed his thumb to the scanner. The screen flickered, revealing a hidden directory titled EP. Inside were folders that detailed a year of systematic psychological warfare, transcripts of intercepted phone calls, scanned copies of her passport, and the original predatory debt contracts that had started it all. "Delete it," Victor said. "All of it, permanent wipe, military-grade overwrite." Vane began to click. One by one, the files vanished. The property of Vane folders, the behavioral modification notes, the recordings of Alina's tears, all turned into zeros and ones, erased from the digital ether. As the progress bar reached 100%, Victor felt a phantom weight lift from the room. The digital shackles were gone, but the legal ones remained. Victor slid a stack of physical documents across the desk. These were not the complex, multi-page traps Vane was used to. They were simple, blunt, and final. They were the legal equivalent of a surrender. "Sign," Victor ordered. "This is a total release of all claims, a full transfer of the medical debt to a third-party non-profit that you can never touch, and a permanent restraining order that, if breached, triggers a data dump of your archive directly to the federal authorities." Vane's pen scratched against the paper, his signature a jagged, ugly scrawl. He was signing away his leverage, his power, and the very foundation of his ego. As he finished the last page, Victor took the documents and checked them with a clinical eye. "Now the passport," Victor said. Vane reached into a hidden compartment beneath the desk and pulled out a small blue booklet. Alina's passport. He handed it over like a man surrendering his last weapon. Victor took it, tucked it into his inner jacket pocket, and for the first time that night, he felt the cycle of the past 7 years truly break. He wasn't just observing a tragedy anymore. He was holding the keys to its end. "What happens to me now?" Vane asked, his voice a hollow rasp. Victor looked at him, and for a moment, Vane saw the man behind the boss, the man who had watched Isabella vanish into the dark. "You disappear, Julian. You resign your board seats by morning. You move to that estate in the Hamptons you bought with stolen blood, and you stay there. You don't speak. You don't invest. You don't look at another woman under the age of 30. You live in the silence you tried to build for her." Victor turned toward the door, his silhouette tall against the glowing city skyline. "The ghost protocol is permanent. My men will be watching your accounts. If you spend so much as $1 on a private investigator, or if a single photo of Alina surfaces anywhere on the web, I won't send a computer virus. I'll send Wyatt, and he doesn't believe in erasures. Victor walked out of the office, his footsteps echoing through the hollowed-out penthouse. He didn't look back at the broken man behind the desk. He had achieved the erasure, not just of the data, but of the fear that had defined Alina's life. As he reached the elevator, Marcus met him, holding a phone. "The non-profit has confirmed the debt transfer, sir, and the father's medical team has been briefed. They're ready for the move." "And Alina?" Victor asked. "She's at the safe house. She hasn't said much. She just asked for a glass of water and sat by the window." Victor nodded, stepping into the elevator. The doors closed, sealing away the world of Julian Vane forever. As the lift descended, Victor looked at the reflection of the girl's passport in his hand. He had spent a lifetime making people disappear for the wrong reasons. Tonight, he had made a prisoner disappear from her cage, and in doing so, he felt the first touch of the light he had thought he'd lost forever. The erasure was complete. Alina Park no longer existed as a project or a possession. She was just a 19-year-old girl with her whole life ahead of her, and for the first time, the man in the charcoal suit was okay with being the one who had simply paid attention. The safe house was a quiet brownstone tucked away on a street where the trees grew thick enough to muffle the sounds of the city. It was a place that didn't exist on any official map, a sanctuary maintained by a specialized non-profit that Victor had funded in the shadows for years, a quiet penance for the victims he hadn't been able to reach. When the car pulled to the curb, the rain had slowed to a rhythmic mist, turning the cobblestones into a mirror of the street lamps. Victor stepped out first, his eyes scanning the rooftops and the darkened windows of the neighboring houses, with the practiced paranoia of a man who knew that safety was a fragile thing. He opened the door for Alina, who stepped out with the hesitant, bird-like caution of someone who expected the world to tilt on its axis at any moment. She had traded the midnight blue silk dress for a simple, oversized grey sweater provided by his team, and in the dim light, she looked even younger than 19. Inside, the house smelled of cedar and lavender, a sharp contrast to the sterile, expensive scent of Julian Vane's penthouse. A woman named Sarah, calm, unassuming, and trained in the delicate geometry of trauma, met them in the foyer. She gave Alina a soft nod, one that required no immediate response, and led them to a small sitting room where a fire crackled in the hearth. Victor stood by the door, his charcoal jacket damp from the rain. He watched Alina as she sat on the edge of a plush armchair. She didn't lean back, she didn't look around. She kept her eyes on her hands, which were interlaced tightly in her lap, her knuckles still white. "The building is secure," Victor said, his voice low and steady, designed to ground her without being intrusive. "There are no cameras here that you don't know about. There are no tracking apps. Julian Vane does not know this street exists." He walked over and placed a small, leather-bound folder on the coffee table in front of her. Beside it, he laid down her blue passport. "Inside that folder is the confirmation of your father's medical trust," Victor explained. "The debt has been dissolved. He is being moved to a private suite at the General Hospital at dawn. He will have the best specialists in the country, and their only mandate is his recovery. You are the only person who can authorize his discharge." Alina's eyes shifted to the passport. She reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed the gold-embossed eagle on the cover. She opened it, staring at her own photo as if looking at a ghost. For a year, her identity had been a bargaining chip, a digital ghost held in a predator's vault. Now it was just a piece of paper in her hand. It was the weight of her own name. He has the copies," she whispered, her voice cracking. It was the first time she had spoken more than a single word since the gala. "He has the videos. He said he would show everyone. He said he would destroy my father's reputation." Victor moved closer, but he didn't sit. He wanted to remain an anchor, not a threat. Julian Vane has nothing. Every server he owned has been scrubbed. Every digital footprint he created has been overwritten with static. To the world, those files never existed. To the law, you have never met him. He saw the tension in her shoulders ripple. She was waiting for the catch. In her world, every rescue came with a bill, and every favor was a hidden snare. "What do I owe you?" she asked, finally looking up at him. Her eyes were dark, searching his face for the hidden ledger. "A man like you, you don't do this for free." Victor felt the old, cold, familiar sting of his own reputation. He looked at the fire, the orange light dancing in his dark eyes. You gave a signal, Alina. You asked a stranger to pay attention. 7 years ago, I met someone like you. I was smart. I calculated the risk, I looked at the profit margins, and I decided that her life wasn't worth the mess it would make of mine. She died because I was a businessman. He looked back at her, his expression unreadable to most, but to someone who had lived in fear, it was a terrifyingly honest transparency. I am not doing this for you to owe me. I am doing this so I can sleep without seeing the color of a yellow scarf in the dark. Your safety is the payment. Your life, lived on your own terms, is the only interest I intend to collect. Alina stared at him, her chest beginning to heave. The mechanical control she had maintained at the gala, the calculated breathing she had used in the penthouse, began to fracture. The realization that the floor wasn't going to fall out from under her was more violent than the fear itself. I don't know how to go back, she sobbed, a small choked sound that seemed to break the last of the silence in the room. You don't go back, Victor said firmly. You go forward. Sarah will help you with the logistics. A new apartment, the university transfer, the medical staff for your father. But for tonight, he paused, his voice softening to a human level she hadn't yet heard. For tonight, you have permission to fall apart. You don't have to be careful anymore. You don't have to watch the space between words. The doors are locked, and I am the one with the key. No one is coming for you. The dam finally broke. Alina tucked her head into her knees and wept, not the quiet, invisible tears of a victim, but the raw, racking sobs of someone who had been holding their breath for a lifetime and finally found air. It was a harrowing, ugly, beautiful sound. Victor stayed. He didn't offer a hollow embrace or a scripted platitude. He simply stood there, a silent sentinel in a charcoal suit, providing the one thing Julian Vane never could, a space where she was allowed to be weak so she could eventually be strong. He watched the fire burn down to embers, the weight of the night finally settling. For the first time in 7 years, the ghost of Isabella wasn't screaming. He stepped out of the room quietly, leaving Alina in Sarah's capable hands. As he walked toward the front door, he felt the cool night air through the open transom. He was a Mafia boss, a man of shadows and blood. But as he looked back at the brownstone, he knew that this single act of bad business was the only thing he had ever done that truly mattered. He had given her safety, and in return, he had found a version of himself that he didn't have to hide from. He stepped back into the rain, the door clicking shut behind him. The signal had been answered. The debt was paid. The passage of time in the city was usually measured by the changing skylines and the shifting alliances of the underworld, but for Victor Hahn, it was measured by a growing, quiet stillness. 3 years had passed since the night the glass monolith of Julian Vane's penthouse had been hollowed out. In that time, Victor had continued to move through the world like smoke, a businessman of high-stakes shadows, but the edge of his ruthlessness had been tempered by a newfound vigilance. He no longer just looked for threats, he looked for people. It was an unseasonably warm afternoon in Boston. Victor was in town to oversee a legitimate shipping merger, walking through the brick-lined corridors of a university district where the air smelled of old books and spring blossoms. He moved without a security detail, a luxury he afforded himself in cities where his name didn't carry the weight of a death sentence. He was just another man in a well-tailored navy coat, blending into the ebb and flow of students and faculty. Near the entrance of a modern glass annex, he saw a crowd gathered around a digital kiosk. A seminar was about to begin, and a large poster stood beside the door. It featured a woman with sharp, intelligent eyes and a posture that spoke of a quiet, unshakable strength. The name at the bottom read, Alina Park, founder of the Signal Initiative. Victor stopped, his heart, usually a steady, clinical rhythm, hitched. He looked at the face on the poster. The porcelain fragility was gone. The too careful tilt of the head had been replaced by a grounded, powerful presence. She wasn't a shadow anymore, she was the light. He moved toward the back of the lecture hall, slipping into a seat in the dimness of the last row. On the stage, Alina was speaking to a room full of young women and social workers. She wasn't wearing midnight blue silk. She wore a simple white blazer and jeans. She spoke with a voice that was clear and resonant, a voice that had clearly spent the last 3 years reclaiming the territory it had lost. The truth is, Alina was saying, her hands moving with a confidence that made Victor's chest tighten, the world is often looking, but it rarely sees. We are taught to mind our own business, to ignore the cracks in the veneer of the people around us. But safety isn't just a law or a locked door. Safety is the person who notices the space between your words. Safety is the stranger who sees the signal and decides that your life is worth the mess. She paused, her gaze sweeping over the audience. For a split second, her eyes passed over the back row, and Victor felt a jolt of recognition. She didn't stop her speech, but there was a microscopic softening in her expression, a ghost of a smile that told him she knew exactly who was sitting in the shadows. "I am here today because one person decided to pay attention," she continued. "And because of that, I can teach you how to look for the patterns of control, how to recognize the digital shackles, and how to give the signal that can change everything." When the session ended, the crowd swarmed the stage, but Victor waited. He stood near the exit, his hands in his pockets, watching the way she interacted with the students. She listened with her whole body, offering the kind of presence he had once offered her in a safe house brownstone. Eventually, the room cleared. Elena gathered her tablet and walked toward the back of the hall. She stopped a few feet from him, the sunlight from the high windows catching the gold of her necklace. It wasn't a gilded leash, it was a simple pendant of a bird in flight. "You're late for the merger meeting, Victor," she said, her voice warm and laced with a hint of wit. Victor allowed a genuine smile to touch his face, a rare occurrence that reached his eyes. "I find that some things are more important than profit margins. You've been busy, Elena." "I have," she said, standing before him with the poise of a woman who owned every inch of the floor beneath her. "My father is doing well. He's walking again. He asks about his anonymous benefactor often. I told him you were a man who appreciated the value of a good ledger." "He's not wrong," Victor replied, "though I've found my accounting methods have changed." They walked out of the hall together, stepping into the brisk Boston air. They were two people whose lives had intersected at a point of absolute darkness and had somehow emerged on the other side. "The signal," Victor said, gesturing to the posters. "You're teaching it everywhere." "Everywhere I can," Elena said, "because you were right that night. There are so many ghosts walking around in plain sight. They just need someone to stay vigilant, someone to keep noticing." She stopped at the corner where a car was waiting for her. She turned to him, and for a moment, the years fell away. He saw the girl in the midnight blue dress, and she saw the man who had slammed a predator against a window to prove she was free. "Thank you, Victor," she said softly, "not just for the penthouse, but for seeing me. No one had ever really seen me before that night." "You made it easy, Elena," Victor said. "You were the only truth in a room full of lies." She reached out and briefly touched his arm, a light, fleeting gesture that carried no fear, only the weight of a shared history. Then she stepped into her car and disappeared into the city. Victor stood on the sidewalk for a long time after she was gone. He looked at the people passing by, the business travelers checking their watches, the couples laughing, the students lost in their own worlds. He thought of Isabella and the yellow scarf. He thought of the 7 years he had spent in the cold, and how a single 5-finger signal from a 19-year-old girl had finally brought him home. He wasn't a good man by the world's standards. He still lived in the shadows, and his name still made certain people tremble. But as he turned to walk back toward his own life, he felt a profound sense of redemption. He couldn't save everyone, and he couldn't undo the past, but he could remain vigilant. He could keep his eyes open for the next silent plea. Because in the end, that was the only power that mattered, the willingness to act on what you saw. Victor Han moved into the crowd, no longer just a boss or a predator, but a man who finally understood that the most important thing he could ever own was the ability to pay attention. The echo of the signal followed him, a quiet promise that as long as he was watching, the silence would never win again.